My name's Hugh Wood. I'm the lead developer at Rencore on the SPCAF project. You can email me or contact me at Twitter, Hugh AJ Wood. I've been developing for quite a long time now. So I did this at college, I did this at university. I even went and did a second degree in development because I was bored. Took a bit of time out to be a systems analyst and information architect. But now I'm back at being a developer and I absolutely love it. So, what we're going to look at. If this changes. There we go. We're going to have a little bit of an introduction to this. Some people call it a mess. I call it actually something very clever that Microsoft did. You'll argue with me that maybe later, but I'll put my argument up on the slides, and then you can come talk to me afterwards. We're going to look at how SharePoint structures its files. There are a lot of JavaScript files in SharePoint. There's more lines of JavaScript than there is in C# now. We're going to have a look at how it handles garbage collection, because if you're using MDS, it has to do something that it doesn't kill your browser with memory. So if you think about it, if you're going through page after page after page, you're using memory on every single request, how does it handle that? We're going to look at something called dynamic module loading. So if you're a C# developer, who's a C# developer? That's a really good start, because this is for C# developers who want to try and find out why they need to learn JS. This is pretty much like a DLL, OK? So I'll be covering that as well. Pour myself a little glass of water. And then we're also going to look at some helper methods. Some stuff that Microsoft have actually provided that a lot of people don't know are already there. And there's a few caveats on this point as well. So, JavaScript. My beautiful fiancée made this funny little picture for me when I first started doing this presentation. If you know the game, you don't know JS, yeah, it's a complete rip-off. But I think it kind of portrays what the point of this presentation is quite accurately. You might have been doing JavaScript in SharePoint for a long time, but because of the lack of documentation, there is so much more you're probably not even aware of. And you're probably not even aware of the direction in which it's going to be going. There's a lot of people in the community that say we need to completely go back to server-side code. There's other guys who just love the JS side, like Andrew Connell, who will go for REST. And we can still use that server-side as well. I think the hate is well-founded. Microsoft had massive arguments with Google, ECMA, on the actual standards of the language. And that actually put us back by about 6 years in the development of the language. We'd be a lot further along now if they could have just got together in the first place and sorted it out. And the reason that I actually realized that this is a problem was a few years ago. It's about 6 months after 2010 came out. I was doing my first 2010 project. And I'd done a lot of web development work. And what the customer would have liked was a search page, which they could scroll down, it automatically loaded more results. Fantastic idea. So I wrote the proof of concept, and it worked fantastically. I put it to the project lead, and he said, we can't support that. None of the other developers do JavaScript. We're working in web technology. Why can't they do JavaScript? Because we just work in C#. We just do web parts. That's quite shocking. Because if we're working in web technology, most of the time, the users interact with JavaScript. So we need to move forwards. And that's exactly what's going on with all the projects that are going on across the board. This yellow line is all the projects in GitHub of JavaScript. It is way above any other language out there. It's 6 times more projects in JavaScript than there are in C# around the world. The technology is moving that fast. It is now a full stack programming language. It is no longer just something that you throw in a browser that Brendan Ake made in, what was it, 95? It's something that we can actually use to produce something that's better for our customers. Another thing to note is C# is this purple line. It's remained constant. It's not developed in recent times as far as other programming languages. I see in the vNext version, we are going to get some really cool stuff with ASP.NET. But we're not going to be using any of that for at least 12 years, I wouldn't have thought, with SharePoint. But with the JavaScript, we've been using the vNext version in SharePoint since SharePoint 2013. Things like scripts on demand, which was introduced in 2010, was designed to add modules. We've got various other ways of doing namespacing. Because of the way JavaScript works, we can do that. At the moment, it's a workaround. We now do this via TypeScript, and it generates it for us. This summer, when we get the new standard, we'll have classes, we'll have namespaces, we'll have modules, we'll have everything that we really, really enjoy in C# that makes our lives easier and makes all our code separate, and it gives everything a separate, responsible role in the development process. But exactly what are the differences between C# and JavaScript at the moment? We call C# a multi-paradigm programming language. That means it pretty much covers everything that we do in software development. You can write it as a functional programming language. You can write it as an object-oriented programming language. It doesn't matter. You can write it loosely typed. You don't have to have strongly typed variables in C#. And the biggest thing is they are completely different standards. If you write C# and you go to write JavaScript, you are writing something completely different. There isn't anything that's the same. Inheritance, the first-class citizens, statements, variables, compilation, optimizations, the lexical scope, the program flow, the nodes of the code, the types that are involved, and the operators all work completely differently. So you can't just say, well, I know C#, it looks the same, you just got braces. That's not it. If you've not gone back to learn the basics of the language, so I'm asking you now just to go back, have a look at a cheat sheet if you have to, learn the basics of the standard. The biggest things that I can think of that are different between C# that kind of highlight this fact is the compilation and the optimization. Now, I deal a lot in compiler theory in my job, okay? I pull apart code, create graphs from the code, create trees, and actually have a look at the structure before and after it's been through a compiler. JavaScript hardly gets optimized at all because it has to be done in real time. C# goes through lots of optimizations, okay? An example for this is a for loop. In C#, over 80% of the time, it will become a while loop in your code when it's being compiled. The speed of this is significantly improved just by doing this one step, okay? You're halving the amount of operations that the computer has to do to be able to perform that loop straight away. You don't get that in JavaScript. So like one of the best practices we say is to use a while loop in JavaScript. You'll get that benefit. Don't reference other objects in a for loop because you're adding lots of other things in. C# will optimize this out. And you won't get these problems. But these aren't things that the language will do for you. These are things that you need to learn and need to know just to write basic JavaScript. Now, SharePoint always has this thing of doing things differently. But in reality, since 2010, it's been moving forward to the release of JavaScript that is coming this summer. We're still not going to be able to use this version 6 for, I would say, about 6 years. So we need to learn. I still need to learn some as well. There are plenty of classes and things that I haven't learned. But we all need to learn what SharePoint gives us. Because these are the important things that we've been pulling over from our server-side code into our client side. Now, this will be totally aimed at version 15, version 16 of SharePoint. So you'll be able to pull this forward into the vNext as well, okay? Because we won't have the new technology in vNext. The browsers won't support it. So I want to look at something called a module pattern. Who knows what a namespace is in C#? I'm sure some C# developers didn't put their hands up, and that's worrying. But basically, module pattern is an extended namespace that allows you to have a finalizer and an initializer. It has public-facing methods. You can extend it. You can add other parts to it. And some methods that are in a different part of the namespace need to operate together. C# gives you this. JavaScript does not. But we can still use the same pattern. And that's why we turn to the module pattern, because it is implementable in any programming language. So we'll have a look at the basic file structure of the module pattern so we can see how it relates to being a namespace. Let's come out of this. No, I don't want to record myself. Just zoom in. So, yeah, and just put that on the other one. Thank you, Matt. There we go. So, here we've got quite a simple implementation of a module in JavaScript. The first important thing in JavaScript, there is only one lexical scope of a method, okay? And that is a method itself. The global scope doesn't really exist. It's quite broken. And for that reason, we avoid it. We avoid using the global scope. It causes collisions. There's no checks. There's nothing hard that we can put into the global scope to prevent problems. So we need a namespace in JavaScript. We need to use it. That's why we have it in C#. Imagine if you tried to write all your code in C# in a single file and then try to deploy that. A, it'd be a mess. You wouldn't be able to keep on top of any updates that you need to do. And B, you get down 5,000 lines into your little file, you have no idea if you've used the same variable name, and things will just collide. Now, I'm sure you know that's what a namespace is for, but seeing as though half of you didn't put your hand up, it's a little bit of extra coverage. So what we're doing here, we have some private values in here that we don't want anyone else to see outside of our namespace. In this instance, our namespace is a method, function evolutions. That allows anything we put in there to be private, unless we want someone to see it. And what we also have is something that is eventually going to be public. So we create an object for these two things. Now, the first object, I didn't know that did that. So the first object is a string. The second object is called an object literal. And this can house anything you want. In JavaScript, you can embed anything into anything, whether it be a string, an object, another method. But this causes us more problems if we don't know how to handle it, because this works completely differently to the scope that we have in C#. If we create a variable in an if statement or a for loop or something, we know what scope it's going to be in C#. In JavaScript, it's going to be in the entire method. And I've seen hundreds of very small bugs and samples that have fallen down to this just because someone doesn't know the difference between C# and JavaScript. And what we do from our method is we return what we want to be public. So then we separate our internal, our private, and our public. But what happens when we want to start extending this and making it neater? JavaScript adds functionality that you probably won't recognize. I mean, who here has done functional programming in C# before? Or Haskell? Okay. Who here has done functional programming in JavaScript? Who here has used jQuery? Awesome, you've done functional programming, a little bit anyway. Functional programming is a completely different paradigm to object-oriented. And if you're not aware that you're using it, you can run into issues. Things like this appear. Different formats of code. Now what this actually does is it calls that method straight away. But if it's the first time you've seen that and you've walked into a room and started writing JavaScript and you come across this in someone's code, you might think it's a mistake. You might wonder how this is actually executed. In actual fact, the first example and the second example are the same. They do exactly the same thing. But when we write JavaScript, we prefer to do the second because it reduces the amount of lines of code, increases the neatness of the code as well. So what are the benefits to this pattern? Here, we're using the document object. We might be using the document object a lot in our code. But one thing you've got to remember is your customers are downloading that onto their client, into their browser. Okay? Every single byte of data counts. So we can actually use this as an optimization. If I pass in document at the bottom, that's the only time an optimized JavaScript file will actually read document. So if we minify the code, everywhere that we've used document, elsewhere inside our code will get converted down to a much smaller name. It's a very, very simple pattern that can help you increase performance. And that's the reason JavaScript is built as it is. It's built for browsers. It's built because there are speed problems. Now, ASP.NET comes into the realm and tries to help out. You can actually make any type of object or method, or even a string if you want to, a namespace. Okay? All it does is it adds a little property onto the object. That's another thing about functional programming. Anything is a first-class citizen can have a property. We don't do this in C#. I can have a method that's attached to a string if I wanted to. Many people see this as a completely alien concept, but it's also something that you need to learn. So what it does is it adds this namespace property, and we've told it to create evolutions. Now, I've said that we need an initialization method on our module pattern. So our first method that we created in the first examples can become our initializer. And we can then use it to pass back an object, and it become its own finalizer, thus simplifying the pattern. The reason this works is because we treat it as an object that returns a value. That value can become nullable. And if we want another one, we can just ask for a new version. But what use is it if we've just added this property that just says namespace? It's a lot of use to SharePoint. Okay? So we'll come back to that in a second. Just go back to the slide deck. This is why we need ASP.NET to identify our namespaces, and why we need the module pattern to separate our code into namespaces. It's the asynchronous download manager. It is the technology behind something called MDS. So has anyone heard of MDS? Just put your hands up. That's really awesome. It's a great buzzword. But MDS doesn't actually exist. It is just a buzzword. It's a set of technologies that work together to decrease the amount of data that's transferred to the client. So if you're in Waldeck's session just now, and he was talking about SPAs, that's exactly what it's designed to do. But on top of that, it's also designed to do other things, such as loading modules using scripts on demand. Does the client-side rendering through display templates on your lists. It controls so much of the UI that the UI doesn't exist when the page first loads, just like the single-page application if you're in Waldeck's session. But if you transfer from one page to another, only parts of the page are loaded. How does that page know what to keep and what to throw away? There is quite a complex flow of program behind it. It needs to actually simulate a complete page refresh. So the first thing it does is it resets all the default page elements to blank. It wipes them out. It then fires an event that's hooked into the browser, telling the browser that the page has actually been unloaded and there's nothing there. It then wipes out any other JavaScript that's been registered on body load, in other events on the page. It resets things like scripts on demand, display templates, and other CSR code. It stops any animations that are playing using the SharePoint Animation API. Who knows that the SharePoint Animation API exists? This is another problem that I'll come to later. It restarts telemetry. So if you're finding out how many people have visited a certain page, it resets the counter and sets that back up. Okay? It then goes through the global namespace and deletes everything that's not a namespace or a method. Just removes it, completely trashes it. This is why we need a pattern to simulate a namespace in JavaScript at the moment. We haven't got the technology yet in place in our browsers to do this. So we need the module pattern. Extra styles. If you've added a CSS sheet to the page, or JavaScript that adds styles to the page, anything that's not there on the initial load or registered as the CSS style sheet with the master page is also removed. Okay? And then it starts the page load all over again. Starts reloading all the JavaScript files from scripts on demand. It loads the data into the page. It puts everything into the page, and then it checks to see if the page is correct. If the page is correct, it's got anything wrong with it, it reloads and disables MDS itself and starts the whole process again. This might be something else that you've seen. If you put a piece of script, bit of JavaScript, and just paste it into your master page, into a normal JavaScript script block, you'll see that MDS turns itself off because it can't get rid of this. It's there embedded into the page, and it doesn't know what to do with it. It's not gone through the ASP.NET script manager, and it is not registered code. So it thinks there's something wrong with the page. So what do we need to do to make our code work with the asynchronous download manager? Well, we only need to do two things. We need to register a namespace and tell it what the initialization method is. We only need to tell it what the initialization method is if you want it to load on every single page or every single page refresh. And SharePoint will actually handle this itself if you write your code correctly. So, dynamic module loading is the other part that we need to handle. Scripts on demand. Does anyone use scripts on demand? Who's had problems with scripts on demand? If more of you used it, there'd be a lot more people who had problems with scripts on demand. The only documentation is for the 2010 version, and unfortunately, they changed the implementation in 2013, so it doesn't quite work the same. It has been added to MSDN, so you can kind of work out what the methods in scripts on demand are meant to do. But it doesn't help you at all. But basically, the principle is, if you need some code, you load it at the very point you're about to use it. When we are looking at C#, this is how DLLs work. They are loaded just in time to be executed and then kept resident in memory. And this is why we will register an initialization method. We will register a namespace to stop it from being deleted. It's not available in ECMA 5, which is the current standard we are working on in a browser. It will be available, as I've said. But SharePoint won't be using this. Not for the next version. So, what do we actually need to do to get scripts on demand to load our JavaScript files in a modular fashion? So we're not loading a massive file into our master page. We must use a method around the code and use it as a namespace. That means it needs to be registered. ASP.NET handles this with a type register namespace. There is also type.register class if you just want to make a class. We need to also report when the script is being loaded. It has no idea the script has been loaded onto a page when it's finished loading. I've seen people try and risk it, load a JavaScript file, and then their clients can't get the page to work because things have loaded in a different order at a different speed. Then we need to register if we want our module to be continually rebooted and restarted when we do an MDS page change. So we've registered, in theory, our file. We're told SharePoint it can exist. But we need to load it. And this is where the confusion comes in. And I'll show you exactly what the different methods do in a minute. Some methods just try and load an out-of-the-box file and then load a method from that file. Other ones are designed to be used with custom files. The distinction's not been made for you. So the first one we have is register scripts on demand. This takes a key. It can be anything. Like, for example, if you want to put jQuery and load it from your site assets folder, you can just call the key jQuery. Give it the URL, and that's all you need. It's then registered with the ASP.NET Script Manager, which is the key thing, because that is what Asynchronous Download Manager relies on. But what we can also do is register dependencies. We do this with DLLs. A DLL can be dependent on another DLL. So if you load a DLL that uses a method that requires another DLL, that will be chained. It's the same idea. And we have the load by key method and the load multiple. These are designed that if you don't really want to run anything afterwards, or you don't want to rely on it, you just want to make sure that they're loaded for later use, that you can do it. So you can pass one with load by key, or you can pass an array of multiple keys and have lots of files loaded. And they'll be loaded at any time you want. But one of the cool things about this is you can actually have it loaded synchronously. You can stop the main thread of the page and load those JavaScript files straight away. It might be a bad practice now for modern browsers, but if you've got a client that's still using IE6, I know I did 8 months ago, and they are still on IE6, as British Transport Police. Then you're going to have this problem. But we also need to be able to execute it. And we do this in the same way. But again, the documentation doesn't distinguish between execution and waiting, because scripts on demand gives us the option for either. You might want to write some code that you don't want to actually load the script file in yet, but you want it to be executed when it's loaded. So they give you the execute or delay until script is loaded method. That doesn't load your file. And the number of times I've asked, someone's asked me, why does this not work? And then a shock that it doesn't actually load the file is been quite numerous in the recent years. And I've got one of the most popular recent answers on Stack Exchange on this actual problem. And the next one is execute and execute func. What these do are actually load the files. These are the ones we need. Okay? So if you want to load a file or a part of your module embedded in all these different methods, you've got the execute and execute func. But we can do some cool stuff. If we combine those last two together, we can actually have it work exactly like a DLL load. And the last one is notify. This notify command, notify script loaded and execute waiting jobs, has to be in all of your module files, all the different files that you would put as separate DLLs or different parts of your framework or whatever you want to build to put into a SharePoint context, has to have this at the end. Now, there are some funky hacks that you can do. We created a CDN manager with Scott Hillier that actually uses a little asynchronous thread that just waits until jQuery is ready when loading it from a CDN. It's a great app. If you need to load in CDN JavaScript files, just look up for CDN Manager. It's in the Office Patterns and Practices now. Okay? So it is fully supported by Microsoft. So I'm going to jump back to the code and show exactly what the big deal about this is. Okay? So I first said that we need to tell SharePoint what our initialization method is. Before we changed our module to load itself, the namespace is the initialization method. But what we're going to do now is we're going to use ASP.NET to make us an object. Okay? This will actually make an object for us, call it a namespace, and leave it empty. And then we use this naming convention. What this tells SharePoint is this $_global is the global JavaScript area. And evolutions here will be a namespace. As soon as it spots these two things together, inside a file called evolutions.js, it knows that it needs to keep and reboot this whole namespace every time it does an MDS page load. Okay, so nothing else has changed on that one. But now we come to where it gets actually a lot more complicated. Registering scripts. So the first thing we want to do is we need to register a script with SharePoint to be able to be loaded. Now, how I do this is I use the script injection technique from the patterns and practices to load a small library. And all that does is it lists all the different parts of the modules that are a part of my framework. I might have a security module, a performance module, a module for CSR, module for web parts. But I don't want them all the time. I only want them when I need them. So I just have, when it's actually minified, I think it's about 30 lines of code just to do that. And what this does, so it comes in, so we've got the register script method. We take a file name. Okay, this is the JavaScript file that we want to load. And the key, what we want to call it. So, for example, file name would be the CDN of jQuery. Okay, so / I think it's api.google.com. Mark, is it? The CDN, anyway, the CDN address, I don't remember off the top of my head. I Googled that sort of thing. Okay. Then we can pass in we need the dependencies. If we have any dependencies, it's just an array of keys, of other things that we call them. They don't have to exist yet. We can register dependencies afterwards, as long as we're not trying to load them beforehand. And we've also got something else, on demand. So if you're using an older browser, we can actually say, stop the main thread. We don't have many asynchronous threads to work with, and load our scripts now, if we need to. And this is another undocumented thing. And I'll be coming to this later. How many times have I said undocumented now? Too many. So all I do here is I register our script, register the dependencies, and then if I want them straight away, I call my own little Git script, which wraps up scripts on demand again in a way to pull it back as if I'm loading a DLL. Okay? Because I really like C# as well. I like the way DLLs work. I like how binary works. You know, I work in MSIL in assembly language most of the time. So that's kind of where I'm used to. But I also see its benefit as a C# developer, thinking about it in the same way as our code would normally run. And here, I've just registered the other modules and their dependencies. So I've got evolution security, evolution's performance. Evolution's performance requires request executor, the cross-site library that's provided by SharePoint. All that does is it loads a local server file that then makes the transfer of the data for you to get around any sort of security blocks that the browser might have. It's a very important one. I'd look that up if you've not got any familiarity with it. So let's have a look at this Git script method. I've structured this, and you can go to my blog, spcaf.com/blog, and pull this code off. Okay? A full working framework is there for you to play with. But I've structured this to load exactly like a DLL. Okay? So we pause our current thread by putting it into a callback. So who's used to actions in C# or delegate methods? Okay, that's pretty cool. They are really awesome. They take a little bit of extra work, but they are very, very useful. And this is the same sort of pattern that I decided to use for this, and one that you'll see a lot in JavaScript. So again, we've got the same key. And then we can supply the namespace. So if that file has a namespace, of course it should do because it's working in SharePoint. It needs it for all the MDS functionality to work. We can supply that. If we don't care about the namespace, we can just pass null. It doesn't really matter. And the callback. This is the code that we want to run when we've got our file ready. Okay? And then bsync. This is if, again, if we want it to load by blocking the main thread, or if we want it to load in a separate thread to the main page. Now, I'll stop a second to talk about blocking the main thread. That means that the user won't be able to click stuff or run any other JavaScript on the page. It'll slow the page down. Okay? Might only take 100 milliseconds, hardly any time at all, but it will block that main thread. Okay? So we're coming here, and I've got this little thing. There's a problem. Modern browsers have suddenly blocked our ability to see the private variables of other methods in other files. It's fine if you want to extend a module pattern in a single file. You can still get at the private variables when you've extended it. But if you're spreading it across multiple files, okay, I urge you to look at the blog for this one because this can be quite complicated. What we actually need to do is a bit of a hack. I don't like it, but it's the only way that, with a lot of research that I've found to be able to do it. So what we do is we take the privates and temporarily create public variables for them. We then load in our other file. We attach all our new privates into the private area, and then call the seal method, which then removes the public versions of the privates. Okay? So it just copies them back into the privates, creates the private variables, and everything's hunky-dory. But what about DLLs? How does this work? Well, this is designed to load multiple or one file. Most of the time, if you want a DLL, you only ask for one file. Okay? So we have the first version here. And what we want is the two methods together. We want execute func. This is going to load our method ready that we want to use in our code from the JavaScript file. Okay? But it tells you that it's ready when that actual method is available, not when the whole file is available. And most of the time, you will find that if you use this, there may be a variable that is not accessible that you need to use, or another method inside that method. Sometimes it happens quick enough that it doesn't really matter. But I find it safer just to ignore the callback method that's supplied by execute and execute func. Instead, I use the execute or delay until script loaded. And this gives us the exact functionality that we want. When our module is completely loaded, our DLL type file is completely loaded, the code will be executed. If we want to load multiple, we can do the same thing. Okay? This will work off an event. It'll load each one and tell you all when all these executed delays have been called for every single file. This is why it's important to have it. If you load jQuery in and you don't have notify at the bottom of the file, and you want to use scripts on demand, it's not going to work because it's not called. Okay? It needs to set the flag to say that it's been loaded. And this is the notify scripts, or, oops, sorry, my voice is going now as well. The notify scripts loaded and execute waiting jobs. It's an absolutely huge name, but I think you can work out what it does by the name. It doesn't need a description at that length. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that it's a method. If it's not a method, SharePoint's not loaded. It's in the first JavaScript file in SharePoint. Okay? So I'm going to throw an exception if that's not it. And all it does is it just sets a Boolean flag on that property in scripts on demand to say that your code is loaded. But another note, who likes to use jQuery in SharePoint? Okay, notice problems with jQuery ready with SharePoint. Sometimes it executes and there's nothing on the page. Sometimes it executes at a weird time. That's because the content's not loaded. Okay? And the problem with that is MDS. Now, you can just turn MDS off, but what's the actual problem there? A normal out-of-the-box team site is 5.2 megabytes of data on an initial page load. If you want to turn MDS off, you're loading that every single time. Now, on my internet connection at home, that takes 12 seconds. That's horrible. If you do an MDS page change to the site contents, for example, that's 150 kilobytes of data it needs to transfer from the server. And it happens instantly. Less than 100 milliseconds. That's fantastic for user experience. And that's how SharePoint 2013 and 365 are designed for user experience. So if you turn MDS off, you're killing the user experience. So what do? SharePoint actually provides us a method and an event to look into. Okay? There's two. We can push our methods into the body load, or we can write our own little helper method, which is what I prefer, because it keeps everything stable within my framework. And it cuts down the amount of code, and I can control when and how my code loads afterwards. So what I do for this is I check to see if the body is actually loaded. Now, I know the data's been added to the page. It's an MD5 hash that's added. I don't know if you know what that is. It's not that important. But basically, it's a unique signature to say that that data has come into the page. Then I load my code in a separate thread using setTimeout, which is our asynchronous function. straight away. So I'm not blocking the main thread or whatever thread that I'm running in at that time, which is not supplied by the out-of-the-box method. But this is also helps us, because this is exactly what we would do with the DLL load, how it's done in MSIL from C# in .NET. If it's not, I do push it to the body on load function names, because I have no idea when that's going to load. So I've just attached it to an event that will fire when that is populated. And my code will load in an asynchronous method, just like before. No problems. And we see the rest of the code is the same as the last example. But I want to load in a module. There's lots of things you can do with modules. Best practices for writing JavaScript is a completely different topic. But when you pick them up, you'll notice that methods aren't supplied for some of them. Or you can't find one. It might be there, it's just not documented. Oh God, I said that wrong, didn't I? Anyway. So, I want to write a little security library. One that stops cross-site scripting attacks against my website from people using eval. I don't know if you've heard of it, but eval is evil. Basically, it allows people to inject code into your website and write hacks. It's not very nice. And the other one is a wrapper for the request executor. This allows us to go securely and get data cross-domain from our other SharePoint sites. Okay? And I wanted to wrap these up, and I want to add them in. So if you saw that sealing and unsealing pattern, the only real exception to this is I've taken the evolutions. It's already just been unsealed because we've called that from our scripts on demand implementation. And we add our private variable to the current privates in there. So I've got a little counter to say how many times I've called a request executor, because it's quite performance heavy. It's got to call the server, then the server's got to call another SharePoint site. It's a double hop. It's not very nice. So I want to try and limit that. So I want a counter for debugging. So I add that in. And then, when I notify that the script is loaded by supplying the key, I just reseal it. And what this does is the unseal can only be called from inside itself. Okay? If someone tries to unseal your module from externally, they can't, because your module seals and unseals itself internally. Okay? So you still get secure private variables that can't be changed from the browser. And again, the seal method, which is actually a public method, will then delete all those public variables and put them back inside. It is messy. But why do we have to do this? Why do we have to use scripts on demand? Why do we have to seal and unseal? We don't have version 6 yet. That's what I'm going back to. We need to work in a way the rest of the web works, okay? The way C# works. Because, to be honest, it is the best way. It's more secure, it's faster, and it allows better maintainability of code. So just a basic reminder of the module pattern. The module pattern has privates, publics, and it returns these values to the code. So how are we doing on time? It's 5:15, so about time. And these are what's important. Okay? It's just a very basic pattern that emulates your namespace. Now, the rest of this code, I want you to, if you think that you need to start using this in your code, or if you just want to learn some JavaScript, jump on my blog, and download it and start playing with it. It is complete and ready for you to copy and paste straight into SharePoint. Okay? So I actually have 5 more minutes left on my slide deck. But I just want to talk about this last thing, governance. I've talked a lot about things not being documented in SharePoint with the JavaScript. This is an absolute governance nightmare. Okay, so if you've got a governance guy on your team and they say, well, what are the risks of using this? You can't answer them because you have no idea about its supportability from Microsoft. If you're using out-of-the-box code, you know it's going to be tested and it's guaranteed by Microsoft. If they find a bug, they'll update it themselves. It reduces your development time because you don't have to write the methods yourselves. There's less overhead on the client because they're already optimized code and they work towards the new ECMA 6 standard, which is designed to be faster. And it's easy to maintain your code because you have less helper methods. But problems. What if Microsoft decides to patch something and break it? They've just broken all your code and your customer site might just stop working. But we have that issue anyway. It could actually contain a bug that you don't know. Customer might type in some series of characters and break their entire site just because of a little bug in Microsoft's code. And then you have to wait for it to be patched if it gets patched at all. There's no documentation. So you have no idea, no guidance on how to use this. You need to discover it yourself. Now, it's nice. In your Hive folder in SharePoint, there's a load of debug.js files. You can just go and read them. Okay, they've got no comments, but the variable names are often very self-explanatory, and they're very simple methods. So if there's something that you need to use, I recommend you just search within the debug files for that thing you want to use first to see if it exists. Okay? But only if it's in your governance acceptance. But sometimes, like SP animation that I mentioned earlier, or SharePoint's own task engine for client tasks, they can be overly complex. You might just want to do something simple and think, well, this is really easy in jQuery or something, I'm just going to use that. That's true. They can be overly complex, but they're designed for a multitude of scenarios, like the task engine. If you're uploading a document, it uses the task engine to track the progress. And it keeps calling back, and it uses promises, which is, again, something that's in version 6. The animation engine, which is in the latest HTML5. Everything built into SharePoint is there for our next version, which isn't out yet. But they need to provide that functionality to the UI and to the clients. So we've learned how we need to use JavaScript and how SharePoint works with JavaScript and what SharePoint actually provides. It provides the complete, what we call a shim, from the current version of whatever browser you're using, be it IE6 all the way through to the latest, to the next version of the client UI. But of course, there's pros and cons with the governance. You might not understand reading so much JavaScript, and there's no documentation. You might not trust Microsoft to break your site because you're using that sort of code. You're going to be using JavaScript if you write a web part or an app in SharePoint context or a client-side rendering. So you've got to actually take these things into consideration when you're writing your code. OK, so if you've got any questions, come and talk to me. Everything else is on the blog. If you need any more further guidance, you can feel free to contact me. I can point you exactly in the right direction most of the time. I've got a lot of resources, a lot of files and documents, books, which I can point you to. But there's one thing I hope that people have got in their heads. Even if they thought they knew JavaScript, they don't know JavaScript in SharePoint. It's different. It's Microsoft's own way. Okay?